Welcome to Charity Therapy, a podcast from Birken Law about building better nonprofits. I'm your host, Jess Birken. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Charity Therapy. I am back with my co-host, Megan, and we are here to answer your questions. Megan, what have we got lined up for today?
Hi, Jess. I can already feel it that today is going to get a little bit ranty.
Oh, boy.
Yep. Today we're talking about executive compensation. Dun, dun, dun. I feel like there's always a ton of angst around executive directors and CEO salaries, both from like donors as a whole, but also within the nonprofit sector. So, Jess, before we get into these questions, I want to hear your opinion on this. What's the right way to do executive compensation for a nonprofit?
Oh, yes. This is a big topic that gets people fired up on all angles. So here's the thing. What a lot of nonprofits don't pay attention to is that the IRS enforces this thing called the Federal Private Inurement Prohibition, which basically says people with power at a tax-exempt organization like board members, the officers, key employees, etc., can't get, quote, unreasonable benefits from the nonprofit. Now, that could look like a lot of different things. It could look like buying them a fancy car that isn't really justified, but most often this happens by paying a high-ranking employee an outsized salary. And those are the things that we often see in the news and people get all up in arms about. The IRS says that you can give executives a fair and reasonable compensation. But what is fair and reasonable, right? Unfortunately, there's not like a super easy answer because it all depends on the position, what industry they're in, the size of the nonprofit, the geographical market, right? Like a New York executive director in New York City is going to be different than somebody in upstate New York. The organization needs to strive to pay their executives a market rate, what someone in a similar position at another organization of similar size and mission, et cetera, would make. But there's a lot of gray area there. And so people get bent out of shape about executive comp because they think it's too high or they think it's too low. So that's kind of why this is going to be, it's inherently going to be a ranty episode.
Right. I mean, there's no way around it. All right. I am the executive director of a nonprofit that helps connect folks with housing. I've worked with this org for years after receiving help from them as a young adult, and I've worked my way up. I love my work and this organization, but I'm seriously considering leaving. I don't want to leave, but my pay is just not enough. I'm having trouble making ends meet for my family, but I can't imagine asking for more out of our already tight budget. How do folks make it work in the nonprofit sector?
I love that they were so inspired by the organization that helped them that they wanted to pay it forward and got involved and ended up becoming the ED. That's awesome. What a great story. And probably, like, how do people make it work in the nonprofit sector when they're getting these pittance salaries? It's probably a lot of privilege. A lot of people who have other support systems in their life that allow them to live on the salary that the nonprofit is paying. So first and foremost, I think the answer here is take care of you, right? If you need to make more money and you can move and get a different job, that's not off the table. You don't have to stay here forever. I realize that's an emotional decision, especially with this person's really deep connection to and their history with the organization. But I would say, have an honest conversation with your sort of like best buddy on the board about where you're at, and just be really candid that, it's not working out for you financially, and you don't want to leave, but you also don't know how to fix it. Now, I will say that, and then I would caution you to be prepared that they may turn it around back to you and say, we would love to pay you more. Absolutely. Please go raise the money so that we can do that. Because here's the reality. You're the executive director. And you are the boss. And so if our budget is too small, the board has some leg to stand on to look at you and say, where's the money? Go raise more money. How do we raise more money? And now you can also turn back to them and say, what's your role in raising this money? And maybe it's time to bring in a fundraising consultant and get a plan together, because if you can't even afford to pay your own people, you're not really doing it right as a nonprofit. We can't just expect people to take a vow of poverty in order to work for the nonprofit. We have to pay people a living wage. It's a tough situation, but I do think when you are the executive director, you are going to bear some of the responsibility for that. And if you don't know how to raise more money so that you can deliver the mission at a higher level and you can fund salaries, including your own, it may be time to reach out for assistance. And there are tons of great fundraising consultants out there that can help you figure out this journey. And at the end of the day, if the board is a bunch of jerks and they're like, yeah, sorry, that's just not in the cards, don't even ask us about that, just look for other jobs,
Yeah. The other piece that I was kind of pulling out of this question that I want to bring up, it kind of sounds like this person is dealing with feelings of guilt for needing more money. And I think that can be really common when you're passionate about the mission, that it's like every dollar that's going towards me is not going towards these folks who need housing. And I think there can be a little bit of a difficult balance to hold within yourself of, you know, making sure that you're taking care of yourself and taking care of the nonprofit. And it can feel like the right thing to do to live on the lowest amount possible. But like just said, you have to take care of yourself as well. And just because you're working for a good cause does not mean you don't deserve to be paid for your work.
Yep.
All right, let's get on to question 2. I am the treasurer at a small family foundation. Our executive director does not fulfill executive director duties. He works no more than 4 hours each month, but receives full-time salary from the foundation. There's no board oversight of his performance. Will this cause our foundation legal issues with the IRS?
Well, this is tough because I have no idea what their job description says. Now, it is a small family foundation, so they could be totally right. This could be some spoiled rich kid with a nothing job that is not doing anything, or they could actually have performance objectives and they're meeting them. The listener just says they don't fulfill their duties, but I don't know what that means from this question. Like clocking 40 hours a week on a time clock is not how we should measure performance in this decade anyway. So, what are their performance objectives? Is it to raise XYZ dollars? Is it to make relationships with organizations that the Family Foundation is funding? Is it to create strategic partnerships? I mean, maybe you only see 4 hours a month, but they spend 80 hours a month at lunches and golf outings and schmoozing donors or partners. That might not look like work, but also developing relationships with donors can be confusing to people who don't understand major giving in that work and what those relationship building things look like. I definitely have worked before with people in the nonprofit space where other people at the organization did not understand that person's job and perceived that they were lazy. Like I worked with an art director who designed this beautiful publication, and that takes a lot of creative power. And sometimes when you're creative, and I know this because I was married to a musician, you just have to like spend time thinking, right? Because you are literally creating something in your mind. So this person would like walk around the office periodically and get away from their desk so that they could get space from the problem that they were working on. And everybody's like, oh, that guy just walks around the office all day. It's like, well, yeah, but look at the work product, okay? It's coming along just fine. So that could be the case here, or it just could be some trust baby has a cush gig that they basically do nothing and get paid. It's unlikely there's going to be a problem with the IRS as long as the salary is reasonable and reasonable in light of the budget. And if you're the treasurer and you're a volunteer, remember, you are a volunteer and you don't have to be there. So if it really goads you that much, you could quit. Just rely on the fact that you may not see the work that they're doing and it may be very important work, or just get out.
Right. The last thing you want is to, raise up this big stink and lose your executive director and then realize the foundation is going to be tanking along with it because they were doing a bunch of work that now no one on the board has the bandwidth to do.
Yeah, as a board officer, you should have access to things like what is the job description? What are they doing? Maybe just take the ED to lunch and say, hey, we haven't connected one-on-one in a long time. I would love to, connect with you and find out how it's going, and just listen and see what they say. If they really don't do anything, then But it could be that they're doing a lot of things that just are not obvious to you.
Totally. All right. I've got one last question for you.
Okay.
I am the president of a literacy organization, and we are about to start the search for a new executive director. The last ED was with the organization for many years, and she helped us grow from a tiny org to having a $7 million annual budget. She's very wealthy and never wanted to accept a raise, so she was still making $45,000 a year. We want to be able to make sure to pay the new person fairly, but I'm worried it's going to look bad to increase our executive director pay too much at one time. What do we do?
Well, you can and should do a salary survey to find out what the market rate is. You know that you're probably out of line, so it doesn't need to be that the next person that comes in makes the same amount of money. You can do a salary survey and figure out what the market rate is. That's something you can hire out. That's something we do for our local clients in Minnesota. And there are often nonprofit industry specific salary surveys out there. But even an online search of job positions for similar organizations in your geographic area is better than nothing. There are a few things that you need to do just to ensure that your nonprofit and the board members individually are protected from any sort of bad juju with the IRS. So the first one is, if anybody on the board has a conflict of interest, they should not participate in the discussion and the vote on the executive's salary, right? So if their board member and their spouse is actually up for the executive director role, they can't participate. The second thing would be everybody participating in the discussion and the vote should have reviewed the salary survey data. They should have knowledge of the decision that they're making and what the options were, what the market rates bear out, right? And there's always wiggle room in there. It's not just it's this dollar amount, it's a range. And so you need to have considered what the range is. And third, the decision-making process itself needs to be fully documented in your meeting minutes, in office memos, whatever. You need to include dates, the people who are present, anyone who recused themselves and followed the conflicts policy, how people voted, the salary survey data that was used. The more documentation, the better. Following that practice creates what's called, and this is terrible IRS jargon, a rebuttable presumption of reasonableness. Because remember,
Woo!
the IRS, yeah, I know, that's a mouthful. Rebuttable presumption. A lot of lawyers work at the IRS when they have words like that. So it's just all about documenting that the payments are reasonable, right? And if you document that and it's in real time before you make the determination, then if your organization was ever audited or somebody called into question your integrity, you have the sort of the audit trail or the backup to show that you made a presumably reasonable decision.
So, Jess, that all makes sense from the legal standpoint. But reading this question another way, I'm wondering what you would say to them if they were less concerned about the IRS because they've got all that process down, but more concerned about maybe a donor or someone that is very involved in the organization who looks at their financial statements or looks at their 990s at the end of every year and sees this big jump? Like, how do they communicate about something like that?
I love that you're asking that. Yes. Okay. So financial statements can probably work with your audit partner. If you're big enough to have like an audited financial statement, you can probably work with your partner to put a footnote in explaining why there's a jump up in salaries in that schedule. Because on the 990, you do actually need to list out the highest paid executives. So it is going to be on the 990 if you file a full form 990. And if you, what are we saying, $7 million annual budget? Yeah, they're having consolidated financial statements. So I would just work with the audit partner to clearly communicate why that increase happened and just say something oblique without saying this person who departed was very wealthy and never accepted a raise. You could just say something like the organization conducted a salary survey when bringing in the new executive and made a market rate hiring decision or something like that. But I think it's fair to put something in the notes on the relevant schedules because those are the two places that your donors are going to look. I also tend to think people get overly worried about this. And frankly, most people are not going to notice.
Right. There aren't that many people that are actually digging through all of your statements and things. And if they are, I feel like there's a really great angle you can take that it's just like, as a nonprofit, we believe in paying our people fair wages. And by paying people fairly, we're attracting good talent. Like, I feel like that can be part of the pitch if you do have somebody internally or externally that is really worried about this line item budget change with the change in leadership.
Yeah. And if it's somebody like a major donor or funder you have a relationship with, you're going to have a conversation with them where you go, oh,
Right.
Katrina, she was so great and was with us for such a long time. And she never asked for a raise, but that was her decision. And we can't possibly replace her with somebody at the same price. I mean, you can just say that.
Right.
You're not going to put
Exactly.
that in your 990, but those are conversations you're having with a big funder or a big donor that you're probably talking about this person leaving anyway. So if they ask about that, it's okay to explain that, yes, you benefited from that for a long time and now it has to be course corrected.
And I also just want to say, like, good for this person for being like, we do need to expand the budget for this person's salary and
Oh,
not
yeah.
expecting that they can find someone else who's doing the same thing. Because if you have a $7 million budget for this organization, that you want someone who has the talent and the know-how and everything to be able to steward that nonprofit and grow it and do things right. Like, you don't want to get in a situation where you're hiring someone for very little money with no experience because it's what you can get for that same rate.
Yeah. And the 45 grand was probably very reasonable for the tiny org that they started out at. And that's
Yep.
fine. But that's no longer the case.
Nope.
Absolutely.
Okay. I have a couple of takeaways for us here. A big one is just that there is no silver bullet to executive compensation. There's no like, oh, I met this threshold and I'm paying this much, so therefore everything is perfect. You have to strive to pay people fairly and reasonably, and that means looking at market rates for your area. There's no A plus B equals C. The second big one is that just the numbers don't always tell the whole story. Just because you're looking at a high rate or it looks like things maybe aren't matching up, you don't know the entire history of the organization, what that person does. You cannot just reduce it down to, we pay them that much and that seems like a high amount. A third one I think is big and, has kind of led to some of the rants that we see in the sector is that nonprofit professionals should not have to take a vow of poverty, and you have to pay people to attract the talent that you want. Or, like in the first question, they might just have to head out and go work in the for-profit sector to get paid the rates that they need in order to live their lives.
For sure.
And just the last one that I have, when you are deciding on executive compensation, you want to keep an eye on conflicts of interest within the organization and make sure you document all of your decision making to make sure that you are protected in the case of any questions from the IRS or somebody else down the line.
Yes. Love it. Love it. Well done.
Happy to summarize anytime, Jess.
Well, Megan, thanks again for being here today. It's always fun to record together. Folks, if you enjoyed this episode, I need you to share it with a friend. You know someone who needs this episode. So give us a thumbs up, rate us 5 stars, subscribe on your podcast app. It really helps us out. If you have a question or a story to share, we'd love to hear from you. Send me a note online, or I'm waiting for those voice memos. Call 612-208-9120. Thanks for listening. All right, folks, that's our show. Be sure to follow me on Instagram or Twitter at Jess Birken. We want to hear from you. Send us a message at our website, charitytherapy.show. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at birkenlaw.com/signup. Charity Therapy is a production of Birken Law Office, PLLC. Our theme song is by Whalehawk. And remember, folks, this podcast is produced for your entertainment and is not a substitute for actual legal advice.